The fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge used to be a symbol of mystery, but in the late 1960s, it felt like a cold, suffocating shroud. San Francisco was a city paralyzed by a faceless monster that roamed the fog-drenched streets. While the summer of love was fading into a hazy memory of peace, a darker energy took hold. A predator was hunting, not just for lives, but for an audience. He was not merely a killer, he was a master of psychological warfare. Every time the police thought they were close, a new letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, adorned with a crosshairs symbol. The city lived in a state of hypervigilance. Children were walked to school with trembling hands, and every creak in an old house sounded like the footstep of a monster. This was the reign of the Zodiac. A man who wanted the world to watch his brutality. Among his taunts was a grid of symbols so complex it defied linguistics. This was the Z340 cipher. It consisted of 340 characters, a mosaic of strange marks, Greek letters, and geometric shapes. It wasn't just a puzzle, it was a fortress of silence. For over 5 decades, the world's greatest minds threw themselves against this wall. The FBI's seasoned code breakers, the CIA's elite cryptographers, and brilliant mathematicians could not force the symbols to speak. It sat as a testament to a madman's intelligence, a mockery of the justice system. The more time passed, the more it felt like the Zodiac had taken his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only this unsolvable ghost that haunted the halls of history and the minds of investigators who had dedicated their lives to the chase. Yes, enter David Oranchak. He wasn't a government agent, he was a software developer used to finding logic in code. When he first looked at those 340 symbols, something shifted. What started as curiosity transformed into a relentless 14-year obsession. Oranchak didn't just want to solve a puzzle, he wanted to dismantle the wall the killer had built. He spent over a decade staring at those patterns until they appeared in his dreams. For David, the motivation wasn't fame. It was the heavy weight of closure. Every time he sat before his computer, he felt the presence of those who had been silenced. He saw the families who had been forced to live in a vacuum of silence for over 50 years, desperate for an answer that seemed impossible to find. These families were waiting for a name or a confession that never came. Instead, they were met with skepticism and fatigue. Over the years, countless amateur sleuths claimed to have cracked the code. Each time, a flame of hope was doused by the cold reality of mathematical failure. These false cracks became a cruel cycle, turning the Z340 into a punchline for some and a source of despair for others. Many experts eventually believed the cipher was total gibberish, a final cruel joke designed by the killer to ensure his legend would never truly die. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Behind every symbol was a real person whose life was stolen by a ghost that refused to be caught. But David Oranchak refused to believe it was just noise. He knew that even in chaos there is often hidden order. He began to look at the problem through a different lens, leaning into the power of modern computation. He started running complex simulations, testing millions of possible reading directions. Just as the world wrote off the cipher as meaningless, a strange mathematical pattern emerged. It was a flicker of coherence in the static. It was a tiny thread, but for the first time in half a century, it looked like the thread was starting to pull. The monster was about to find his voice again, and the world was not prepared for what he had to say. David Oranchak realized that the mountain he was attempting to climb was too steep for a lone hiker. The Z340 was not just a riddle. It was a labyrinth designed by a mind that delighted in disorientation. To navigate its corridors, David sought out allies across the globe, forming an unlikely brotherhood of codebreakers. In Australia, Sam Blake brought a formidable grasp of mathematical simulations. In Belgium, Jarl van Eycke provided the analytical depth needed to scrutinize the cipher's architecture. They were not law enforcement. They were three men fueled by pure determination, connected by screens and the shared goal of finally silencing a ghost that had haunted humanity for far too long. This was no longer a pen-and-paper endeavor. The team plunged into a digital nightmare, harnessing the power of supercomputers to tear through the cipher's defenses. For months, their machines whirred in calculation, testing millions of possible reading directions. They looked at the grid horizontally, vertically, and backward, trying to find the one orientation that didn't dissolve into gibberish. The complexity was staggering. The Zodiac hadn't just replaced letters with symbols. He had rearranged the very structure of the message. It was like trying to read a book where the words were scattered across three different dimensions, testing their sanity and resolve. Then, the breakthrough arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a subtle shift in geometry. Jarl van Eycke discovered a complex system of diagonal transposition. The killer hadn't written in straight lines. Instead, he had moved through the grid like a knight on a chessboard, skipping across rows and columns in a repeating pattern. This was the key that bypassed decades of traditional cryptanalysis. When the software was adjusted to follow this path, the chaos began to coalesce. The symbols stopped being random shapes and started behaving like language, aligning themselves into the first coherent thoughts seen from this monster in 50 years. The air in David's workspace grew thin as the first coherent English words flickered onto his monitor. "I hope you are having lots of fun." It was a sentence so mundane, yet so chilling when stripped of its context. These were the first words from the Zodiac to be read in over half a century. Seeing them materialize felt like watching a spirit manifest. The excitement that had driven the team for years was suddenly replaced by a heavy dread. This wasn't just a mathematical victory, it was a resurrection. The voice that had terrorized California was filling the room, cold and taunting, whispering directly into their ears from across the abyss of time. As more words surfaced, the tone of the message became increasingly erratic, and the team worked in suspended animation, their fingers hovering over keys as the killer's internal world was laid bare. A profound moral conflict took root in their minds. By cracking the code, were they truly serving justice or giving a sociopath a platform to speak from the grave? They were pulling the gag from his mouth, allowing his toxic thoughts to reach a new generation. The weight of responsibility was immense. They thought of the victims and wondered if this revelation would bring peace or simply reopen old wounds for the families. The tension reached a breaking point as the full structure emerged. The investigators had long theorized that the Z340 contained a confession or perhaps a slip-up that would reveal the killer's identity. They expected a name, a location, or a motive that fit the profile of a rational human. But as the final layers were peeled away, they realized the truth was far more disturbing. The message was a direct response to a recent television broadcast, a defiant rebuttal that challenged everything the police believed about the man they were hunting. The Zodiac wasn't hiding. He was performing, and his latest act was a revelation that defied logic and reason alike. It was an insult to the very concept of sanity, proving that the monster was even more unhinged than imagined. The decoded text was a cold splash of reality that left the room in silence. It read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner because I now have enough slaves to work for me, where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise death." This was not the confession the FBI had hoped for after 50 years of searching. There was no name, no address, and no fingerprints hidden within the prose. Instead, there was a chilling confirmation of the Zodiac's utter disconnection from human empathy. He mocked the authorities' attempts to profile him on television, dismissing a caller who had claimed to be him on a popular talk show. To the Zodiac, the threat of the state-mandated gas chamber was not a deterrent, but a gateway. He viewed his horrific crimes as a recruitment drive to populate a twisted version of heaven he called paradise. The misspelling was a motif of his fractured mind that appeared throughout his letters. Writing paradise with a C instead of an S was a deliberate stamp of his warped reality. For David Oranchak and his team, seeing the full text was a moment of deep realization. They had spent decades chasing a man who viewed murder as a divine game and his victims as property for the hereafter. The psychological profile revealed by these symbols was that of a man who didn't kill for revenge or profit, but for a delusional sense of destiny. He was the architect of a nightmare afterlife, obsessed with his own twisted legacy. The victory felt hollow in the halls of justice. The cipher was broken, yet the man behind the curtain remained a shadow. Law enforcement acknowledged the breakthrough with respect, but they were left with the same cold trail they had followed since the 1970s. The Zodiac had used his intelligence to secure his legend, ensuring that even when his secrets were laid bare, his identity remained a void. It was a frustrating paradox. They finally knew exactly what he was thinking, but they were no closer to knowing who he was or his final fate. For the families of the victims, the revelation was a double-edged sword. For 51 years, they had lived with the hope that the Z340 held the key to the killer's true name. They imagined a deathbed confession or a detail that would lead police to a specific front door. Instead, they were met with the rambling words of a man who laughed at their pain. The realization that the Zodiac had taken his secrets to the grave, using his final puzzle only to inflict more psychological torture, was a heavy burden. He had reached out from the past not to seek redemption, but to remind them he won. Yet, there was a glimmer of redemption in the work of David, Sam, and Jarl. Their achievement was a testament to the power of human persistence. Where the greatest minds of the Cold War had failed, three men with a shared passion and modern technology had succeeded. They proved that no matter how deep evil hides its tracks, the light of reason can eventually find a way through the darkness. It was a victory of communities over the isolation of a sociopath, showing that truth is worth pursuing, even when it offers no easy answers. As the dust settled, a haunting thought remained. If it took over half a century to decode these 340 characters, what other messages are still hidden in the archives? The Zodiac was obsessed with his own voice, leaving a trail of symbols that may still hold secrets we are too blind to perceive. Somewhere in the silence of history, another cipher might be waiting, hidden in plain sight and mocking us with a truth we haven't yet learned how to read. The ghost is silent, but the symbols remain.